Hi everyone. You can hear me obviously. I don't have to yell. So my name is Randy Generou. For anybody that doesn't know me, I'm the Associate VP Academic here at Mount Royal University, and I'm really pleased to welcome you here today to our talk by Dr. Richard Arum from New York University. Dr. Arum fills 3 roles at New York University. He's the professor in the Department of Sociology. He's also jointly appointed to the Steinhardt School of Education and is the director of the Institute of Human Development and Social Change. Dr. Arum is also director of the Education Research Program and the Social Science Research Council, where he oversaw the development of the Research Alliance for New York City Schools, a research consortium designed to conduct ongoing evaluations of New York City public schools. Richard is the author of the book Judging School Discipline, The Crisis of Moral Authority in American Schools, which would be a whole other interesting talk, I'm sure. He's the co-editor of the cross-national project, Improving Learning Environments, School Discipline, and Student Achievement in Comparative Perspective. He's the co-author of a comparative study on expansion, differentiation, and access to higher education in 15 different countries. It's called The Stratification in Higher Education, a Comparative Study. Again, wish we had him here to talk to us about that as well. And he's the co-author of Academically Adrift, Limited Learning on college campuses, which is certainly directly related to what we're going to be hearing about today. Mount Royal University's goal is to become Canada's premier undergraduate university in terms of student success. And Dr. Arum's work is certainly highly relevant to our goal of achieving optimal student success. He's looked in his research at what student success means, how it might be best measured, and to what extent it's actually being realized in undergraduate universities and colleges. And he's going to be talking to us today about learning during unsettled times, NAP title, looking at a research project tracking collegiate experiences, undergraduate learning, and post-college outcomes after graduates get out for several thousand students across a number of institutions in the U.S. Because of the relevance of this work to what we're trying to accomplish here at Mount Royal, I'm really looking forward to his presentation and also the question and answer discussion period afterwards. So Richard wanted to make sure he left lots of time for questions and discussion. So by all means, as you're listening, jot down some ideas for questions, and we will really look forward to that part as well. So without further ado, please join me in providing a warm Mount Royal welcome to Dr. Richard Arum.
Randy, thank you for that generous introduction, and thank you for making time to come and hear this presentation today. And one of the things I'm going to be interested in at the end of the presentation, the research is based on a recent cohort of students in U.S. colleges and universities, a very diverse group of colleges and universities, more or less representative of U.S. higher education. And I'm going to be interested at the end of the talk, are there similarities or differences with what you've experienced here at Mount Royal? Can we generalize from these this U.S. research beyond the national borders to say something about the implications here in Canada? So as Randy mentioned in the introduction, much of today's findings will be based on this book that came out 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, January 2011, called Academically Adrift, and that was based on the first 2 years of students' college experiences in the U.S. Since that book's publication, these students have finished college, if they finished on time in 2009, and continued on into the labor market. And we continued to track them over time. And so the book is based just on the first 2 years of their college experiences. I'll talk today about their full 4 years of college experiences, the findings based on that research, as well as where they are today. And specifically, I'll address these 4 research questions. And I can't help it, there's an educator in me that I always kind of start with. These are our learning objectives for today, right? So at the end of today's lecture, you'll have an answer to these questions. One simple, a basic question: to what extent are students improving their critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing skills while at college? Now, let's say from the start, that's not all that college is about: critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing. For example, you see I didn't mention subject-specific knowledge of a particular discipline or field. We don't assess that, and so we're not able to address that one way or another in this study. Also, arguably, colleges and universities are about things that aren't academic, about social development and social skills. Again, interesting and important, but not in the scope of this work. The ones we do look at, however, these critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing skills, are thought by many to be at the heart, the core of modern life in general, and the missions of colleges in particular. And so if you ask faculty, 95% of faculty say critical thinking and complex reasoning are important goals of a college education. These are the skills that individuals bring with them as they move through life from job to job, industry to industry, occupation to occupation. And in today's world, in today's economy, you don't end up getting trained for one job and stick with it for the rest of your life often. You move from job to job and occupation to occupation. And it's these generic skills, these collegiate skills, that do one well in making those transitions, as we'll see shortly. So that was the first question. The second one, I'm a sociologist by training, and so I'm very interested in inequalities in educational outcomes and labor market outcomes. And so the second question I'm going to be addressing today is, are students' social background characteristics associated with inequality in college learning? That is gender, social class background, race and ethnicity. Are these things related to learning outcomes? Third, maybe the most important question for educators is, what are the specific experiences in college context that are associated with greater learning gains? Right? We have variation in the data and how much students learn. If you're an educator, likely would be interested in what are the factors, what are the conditions whereby some students learn more than others. So that's the third question. And then fourth, the general question, how are these individuals faring today as college graduates during this very difficult economic period that is probably true of all of North America, maybe less so in Calgary with the oil boom folks are experiencing locally. But for the rest of North America, difficult economic periods. And so how are they faring during this time? And also we became educators often in the first place because we were interested in improving the lives of young people. And so I'm sure you'll be very interested in seeing what the lives of a recent cohort of college graduates in the States looks like. Now, to address this question, we had to pull together a unique data set. And we had to pull together a unique data set because the data that existed outside of our work, students were tracked over time, but the federal government did not provide a measure attempt to measure learning outcomes. And so to have a data set that tracked people over time with learning outcomes, we had to put it together ourselves. And so with the help of some foundations, we were able to do that, and also more than 24 collaborating colleges and universities, we were able to put that together. It has the following design. It's, we started with students as they entered college and university in fall 2005. They're given an assessment right when they walk in the door. And I'll tell you about that assessment shortly. Then they're surveyed again, they're assessed again in the spring 2007, the end of their sophomore year, and then the end of their senior year. They're also given surveys sophomore and senior year. We collected their transcripts to see what courses they took. And then finally, after they graduated, as I mentioned earlier, we followed them up to see how they're faring in the labor market. It's a large-scale study. It's not a national. It's not a random probability survey, but again, as we go into detail in the book, I won't take your time up with it here. It looks more or less like higher education in the U.S. It looks more or less representative with two exceptions, and I'll alert you to them here. First of all, there's a bias in our study around gender. U.S. higher education is increasingly becoming female-dominated, with today 57% of the undergraduates female to 43% male. Our survey is even, our study is even more female dominated in that it's about 2/3 female. And that is, we believe it's because our study is voluntary. You had to agree to comply with the study, and women are more likely to voluntarily comply with requests of educators than men. And again, I'd be happy to come back and talk about those gender issues at length later. But because of that bias, we're going to spend very little talking about gender in my presentation, because we don't know whether what we're seeing is due to that bias in who's showing up for the sample or not. The second bias is also important to keep in mind. We had the SAT scores, the standardized test for admission in the U.S. As they enter college, and so we were able to see whether or not the students in our study were representative of the students at the colleges and universities that were part of our project. And what we found was at the top half, the distributions looked perfect. Right? There was no bias. We didn't get just the cream of the crop in our study. However, the bottom quarter of our distribution looks very different than the bottom quarter in the colleges and universities. Again, the true bottom quarter didn't show up into our study. They drop out of the study, they drop out of the project. And so our results, very, very important to keep in mind, are upwardly biased. They overestimate the extent to which students are engaged in academically rigorous coursework, and they overestimate the amount of learning gains that are likely occurring on college or university. If you really had that true bottom, it would drag the results down. Trust me, as we'll see, the results are dismal enough. But please keep in mind that bias. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about the assessment, and then we'll do enough of the setup. We'll get to the findings. But it's important to lay out exactly what the whole logic of the design and our approach was. So our assessment is something that is beginning to become widely used in the U.S. It's called the collegiate learning assessment. Like I said, it measures critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing. Its distinguishing characteristics are the following. One, it is a direct measure, an objective measure of what students can do. Now, why is that important? In the U.S., prior to our work, the standard research being done in higher education was done based on students' self-reports. At the time of graduation, students were asked, how much do you think you learned while you were in the college and university? And in the U.S., guess what they tell you? 90%. We learned a lot. They're very, very confident about their learning that they've done. Of course, they don't know what they don't know. And so we move away from those self-reported measures. We're actually profoundly skeptical of them for reasons I can get in. I'm happy to talk about in the questions and answers later. But instead of that, we have an objective measure. What can the students actually do? Second, it's not a multiple choice test. So there are multiple choice tests out there designed by the Educational Testing Service and by the folks in Iowa that developed the ACT. They find findings very similar to ours. There's a study done out of Wabash that's basically replicated our results with these multiple choice indicators. But we don't use the multiple choice indicator. We think this other assessment measure is much closer to what we believe colleges and universities aspire to do with their students. And again, I'll tell you, I'll explain that to you shortly. What the CLA does is it's a holistic assessment of that asks students to actually do something that they might be asked to do after they graduated college. They're given a set of documents and they're asked to think critically about those documents and write something logical based on it. The last thing about the CLA, it's used widely in the US through this voluntary system of accountability where colleges and universities, 400 are voluntarily measuring student learning outcomes and publicly reporting that data. It's also being used by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is now undergoing, it just completed the feasibility study for the 2016 project, which will measure learning in higher education. And they're using a modified version for the CLA to measure their generic skills. They're also measuring subject-specific skills in economics and engineering. And so the OECD, these are equivalent to, do folks know about PISA and TIMSS in middle school and elementary schools, math and science assessments, cross-national math and science assessments? Well, there's a similar project to do this for higher education, and the CLA is being used as the basis for this. So arguably the CLA is, I believe it's a state-of-the-art instrument out there, but again, like all assessment indicators, it doesn't measure everything, it's limited, it's imperfect, it's flawed. Let me give you an example of what this would look like if you were a student taking the assessment. It's all computer-based, so you'd be in front of a computer, and you'd be given a prompt, something like this. Imagine you're working for a company that's about to buy a corporate jet for sales and marketing purposes, a small corporate jet. Right before you buy it, a similar plane as the one you're about to buy has an accident. And your boss comes to you and says, what should we do? Should we go ahead and make this purchase or not? Please write me a memo letting me know what you think we should do. And here are some documents I'd like you to take a look at as you're preparing the memo. You're given the federal accident report. You're given email correspondences between your boss and the person trying to sell the plane to your boss. You're given technical manuals. You're given newspaper reports on the accident. And you're asked to make sense of these documents and write something logical based on that evidence. Now again, what did we say? Critical thinking. Not all that information is equivalent, right? You have to think critically. What is the source of the data? Reliability, validity, and so on. You got to synthesize information across the documents and write a logical argument using the evidence to do it. Not an easy task, not an easy task. But I think exactly the kind of task that you would expect college students to be able to do better at the longer they were in college and university. There's more information on this assessment, the collegiate learning assessment, at that website below. This was developed by a group called the Council for Aid to Education with psychometricians at Rand and Stanford. Again, I think although it's imperfect and limited and flawed, it is the best indicator out there, in my judgment, although I'm a sociologist, I'm not a psychometrician. So, but that's the indicator we're using. Okay, enough of the setup. Let's get to what we found in our study. The next two slides, I think, are the most important slides you need to hear. Because after the next two slides, you can pretty much leave and you could figure out the rest of it. Probably, pretty much. Okay. Slide number 1, course requirements. We asked students in the spring of their sophomore year, think back about the semester before, the fall of your sophomore year, and tell us how many courses did you take with more than 20 pages of writing? How many, listen to the question. We were a naive social scientist. How many courses? The data came back so skewed to 0. We just put up here, did you take any course? Okay, it's not what we were expecting, right? We thought students were taking 20 pages over the course of the semester. They'd have 2 or 3 courses like this. 50% of the sample came back and said, we have no course where we wrote more than 20 pages over the course of the semester. Not a single class. And when we asked them the next question, how many classes did you take with more than 40 pages of reading per week? Again, it came back skewed to 0. 32% of the students came back and said, no course with more than 40 pages of reading. Right? So it's not everyone, not everywhere, but the following is certainly true in U.S. colleges and universities. And this is like I said, it's fairly representative of U.S. colleges and universities. The following is true. Large numbers of students are able to make it through college and university without taking courses with reading and writing requirements, with significant reading and writing requirements. Okay, next slide. Time use. What are students doing with their time? What we find is the following. Students say that they spend 15 hours a week in class and lab, and that's certainly true if they show up to all their classes and labs. If you go to big lecture classes on many campuses, including the one I teach at, you find often that not to be the case, or at least not the case unless they have clickers where attendance is taken. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt. 15 hours a week in class and lab. How many hours studying? Well, students will tell you on average, full-time college students in the States, that on average they spend 12 to 13 hours per week studying, a third of which is with friends. A third of which is they're studying with friends. And we find, I'll show you later on, studying with friends does not lead to growth on the CLA indicator. It leads actually to declines over time. Declines at the same rate as being in a fraternity and a sorority. So traditional hours studying, hours alone. The typical college student in the U.S. today reports that they spend 8 hours per week studying alone. 8 hours per week. And studying alone today is different than studying alone in the, studying alone today is with our smartphones and our email and our Facebook. It's interrupted time. It's not old-fashioned studying alone. 8 hours, about an hour, a little bit more than an hour a day, full-time college students. 36% of our sample, 36% of our sample said they study alone 5 or fewer hours per week, less than an hour a day, 5 or fewer hours per week. Now, we have their transcripts. We figure, okay, well, these kids are going to be getting hammered by their studying only an hour, less than an hour a day for all their classes. Guess what their grade point average is? 3.2. It's closer to a B plus than a B. They're doing fine. And go back. Remember that why they're doing fine. They don't have to read and write in most of their classes. They can pick easy classes. I can go to any college and university in the US, I'm sure it's true in Canada, and use social media to find out in 5 minutes where the classes are I can take for easy A's. I can do that in 5 minutes, right? We make it easy for students to get by with very little demands and an easy grade point average. Now, the argument, maybe that's not so, maybe 8 hours studying alone, 13 hours in group, maybe that's not so little. So there's always, social scientists, we like to do this comparison, right, to make sense of, is it a lot or a little? So here's some comparisons to try on. First of all, add together the 15 hours in class, 12 to 13 hours studying, including the studying with friends, which again I'm highly skeptical of. 28 hours total, 27, 28. That's less time than students spend in high school in their seats in class. Less time than they spend. They say in the US, if you interview freshmen, we thought college and university was going to be harder than high school, but it's not. It's easier. It's not. It's easier. But they adjust to that. We adjust to our environments. Okay. So that comparison doesn't shed one light on. Another comparison is think about cross-nationally. Is it the same elsewhere? Well, we've got data from Europe now, from the Euro student study, that suggests it's actually looks quite low by international comparisons. So in Europe, in the European Union, there or in the Euro student data, I think it includes countries not in the Union as well. There's only one country that has lower studying time, academic time, than the U.S., and that's the Slovak Republic. Every other country, more hours studying. And we don't even have to go to Korea and China and Taiwan and look there what the studying is. Just even look at Europe, and you see dramatic differences. You could also look over time. And this slide is from labor economists at UC Santa Barbara, Philip Babcock and Mindy Marks, who took the time. We've been surveying students in the U.S. Nationally all the way back to 1960. From college to college, it goes back into the 20s. And what we know from that data is the following: from the 20s to the 60s, a full-time college student spent about 25 hours studying, 15 hours in class, 25 hours studying. Remember, that's what full-time used to mean, 40 hours a week. Then something happened from 1960 on, where the amount of hours studying in U.S. colleges and universities dropped in half. It dropped from 25 hours a week to 12 to 13 hours a week. So something has changed in how students understand what it means to be a college student on campus today. And arguably, there's a complex set of reasons for that, some outside of the colleges and universities' control, some inside our control. Because if we were going to graph on this chart from 60s to 2000, grade points average of students, we'd find this trend, right? We would find that over time, as students do less and less work, their grade point averages go up and up and up. Grade inflation, we give away A's and B's on college campuses today, like in the States, like it's candy on Halloween. Students don't complain, but unfortunately the students aren't getting signals that they're not mastering material that's going to prepare them for work in the future life. They also, because they're situated like every individual in a particular context, historic period in time, they don't understand that what they're doing, it seems normal because they look around them at their peers, Seems normal what they're doing. They don't understand that, they don't know that it wasn't like that a few decades ago. How would they? Nor do they know that in other countries it's not like that. So again, I was saying that's kind of, those slides kind of tell the story. There's a lot of students moving through college and university in the US with very little reading requirements, very little writing requirements, very little effort applied. And so, if you get to assess them at 2 points in time, guess what? This is going to shock you. They don't move up very much. You know, studying less than an hour a day isn't sufficient really to move up very, very far on our assessment indicator, nor on these other multiple choice ones, CAP, or the CAP and the MAP, the Wabash study that replicated our results. It's not sufficient. Some students do, but many of them don't. If the cutoff is, if the CLA is a 100-point test and the cutoff is one point growth, right? After 4 years of college, 36% of the students don't even move up 1 point. Why would they? Where do you it doesn't come from osmosis on college campus. You have to learn what osmosis is. So enough of, I think that's the more depressing part of my talk. There's some other parts that are depressing too, but let's get to some what we can do about it. Because we survey them, we look at their courses, we can see what there's variation. Some students are actually learning quite a lot. In every college and university we looked at, some students were applying themselves, taking rigorous courses, studying a lot, and they moved up a lot, moved up a standard deviation on this indicator. I should also say the test that existed in the 80s showed about a standard deviation growth over a 4-year period. Ours show a half a standard deviation growth. So it looks like the learning gains, just as the hour studying dropped in half, so did the learning gains. But our study, we have variation in what people do and how they perform, and so we're able to look for relationships in the data. We find the following: 1, faculty expectations appear to matter. We asked students in the survey question, do faculty have high expectations for students like you? And we worded the question in a way to invoke group identity in the questions intentionally. And when students said yes, students have high expectations for faculty. When faculty said students have, let me try that one more time. When students said that faculty had high expectations for students like them, they moved further up. Their CLA scores at 0.2 were higher than 0.1. And we've known this in K-12 education for decades. When we train educators to go in and teach elementary and secondary school classrooms, we talk about the importance of high expectations. Students will rise to those expectations. In higher education, we don't do much of training of faculty at all. Right? Faculty are often trained how to do research and scholarship, and then they have to figure out how to teach on their own often. So, it's well known in K-12, maybe not so well known in higher ed. Turns out the reading and writing requirements matter. When you have both, when the student said, yes, I had at least one course with a reading requirement of 40 pages per week on average, at least one course with 20 pages of writing, they learned more than if they didn't. And please excuse those measures. They're vulgar, crude measures. Of course, if we were able to measure them more detailed reading and writing, feedback on writing and so on, we would get even stronger effects. But even these vulgar, crude measures are sufficient to show that these things matter. I alluded to some of these results earlier. The more the line going up, this is hours in the activity. The more hours a student spends studying alone, the higher their test score is at a second point in time, controlling for their test score at the prior point in time. And so effort, time on task actually matters. The instrument is sensitive to these instructional inputs. However, we found that when students said they studied with peers, the hours they said they spent studying with peers, their scores went down at the same rate they said the hours they spent in fraternities and sororities. And that was a tough finding for me. I'm trained as a progressive educator and consider myself a progressive educator. But what I take from these findings is that students on their own studying in groups is not going to lead to productive learning outcomes. You can have highly structured group activities that could be very conducive to learning activities, but on their own, without highly structured activities, this is what you're going to get. I should say we also looked at other time use factors like hours working on campus and off campus. Didn't matter all that much unless you worked a lot of hours, more than 20 hours off campus, didn't matter. Volunteering for clubs and didn't matter. The other time use stuff we measured, interaction with faculty turned out not to matter. And we think partly that's because people interact with faculty on both ends of the spectrum. They go in for special help when they're struggling or when they're excelling. And so with better measures, perhaps you could get at something different. We also looked at where there was more growth across fields of study than others. Of course, students take this with a grain of salt. This is observational data. Students are not randomly assigned to college majors. They choose college majors, and so the interpretation is complicated here. However, what we do find is this consistent pattern. These areas here, social science, humanities, science, and math, the arts and science core of the college and university is where the most learning gains occurred. And we believe that's because in social science and humanities, you had the most reading and writing. You didn't have as much as you did 3 or 4 decades ago, but there were still more likely to have courses with reading and writing requirements there. And in the science and math, not so much reading and writing requirements, but the most hours studying in the college and university. And it suggests that the academic rigor in any area is likely to be conducive to these development of these generic skills. Institutional variations. Do schools matter? Doesn't matter. I've been told Mount Royal prides itself on undergraduate education. Doesn't matter that a student would go here as opposed to another college and university. They didn't care about undergraduate education. Well, I don't want to make an endorsement for this college and university because we don't have the empirical data. However, it does matter where you go. It does matter where you go. We find we're able to do an exercise with the data where it's called Partition the Variance. How much variation happens across colleges and universities? How much happens within? And we find the following. We find 2 important things here. And these patterns, by the way, are just like the data in American elementary and secondary education. You see very similar patterns. 23% of the variance is across institutions. It matters where you go to school. Schools can make a difference. However, it's also true that 77% of the variance is within a college and university. There's more variance within the college and university than across the college and university. So it does matter where you go to school, but it also suggests that there are pockets of excellence at almost every college and university out there. There are pockets where there's academic rigor, students are held to high expectations, students are working hard and applying and learning a lot. And there's also other pockets, what some people have called pockets of despair. The size of these pockets of excellence and despair vary across colleges and universities, but there's, again, more variation within. And that's why, and I'll get to this later in the talk, that's why you need cultures of assessment within your college and university to address the areas that are the places that need improvement. You don't have to go visit the college and university, some exemplary college and university to learn how to do it. You can learn how to do it right here. But you need a culture of assessment to be able to identify the pockets of excellence and the pockets needing improvement. Part of the picture of the institutional variation is college selectivity. That is selectivity of entering students. If you attend a college and university with peers that have higher initial test scores, they're more academic oriented, you're going to learn a little bit more. It's part of the differences in institutional variation, but not all of it. It's just a small part. Two last things about the learning piece, and then we'll get to the labor market results. Remember I said we're going to also talk about how this looks in terms of social inequality in learning outcomes. Well, here we have initial performance as freshmen, 2005. Turns out that even when you control for all the prior SAT scores and grades and so on, it's still true that students whose parents went to graduate professional school are going to score a little higher on this test than students whose parents were just high school graduates. There's a gap when you begin, but if you notice over time, the gap stays about the same. That is, students learn at roughly the same rate in terms of social class background over time, right? They're learning at about the same rate. We don't see significant differences based on parents' education. We do in the US, however, see differences based on race. And so what we find is that the longer students are in college and university, the greater the black-white test gaps grow over time. In the first 2 years of college and university, the gaps grow particularly great differences in growth, often perhaps because the African American students are in remedial coursework where they're not being exposed to rigorous academic experiences. And the final 2 years look a little bit better. Okay, let me briefly touch on where these individuals are, these college graduates 2 years out. These are the successful graduates that made it through college and university in 4 years. So these are the ones we would expect to be doing best. In US colleges and universities, large numbers of students drop out on the way. More than 40% of students drop out. So these are the success students. So again, this is 2 years out. We take out the students that are back in grad school. In our study, a large number of them, the successful students, a third of them were back doing master's programs or graduate programs 2 years out. When we asked them why, diverse set of reasons, everything from kind of very focused career goals to having trouble finding a job, to wanted insurance, healthcare, a big problem in the US. So taking out those that went back to school, if you didn't go back to school full time, what was your labor market outcome 2 years out? What we find is that large numbers of them are unemployed or underemployed, part-time employment, 23% either part-time or unemployed. And if they were lucky enough to find full-time employment, the average earnings were $35,000, which means that about half of them earned less than that. So there were large numbers of students in our study with full-time employment earning $25,000. So lots of them are struggling 2 years out. In the US, in a way that I think is not as pronounced here in Canada, students finance their college educations often with college loans, and loans that the federal government in the US has made it impossible to ever walk away from, or virtually impossible. You can't declare bankruptcy and wash your hands of them like you can do with a house loan. So we find 2/3 of the students in our study have college loans. On average, these loans are $27,000, but again, there's a significant number of individuals in our study with more than $50,000 of loans. 10% of the students. And again, you saw what their labor market outcomes were. Now, what about trying to make sense of the unemployment? One of the things we find very striking in the pattern of unemployment data was we're able, because we have these objective measures of performance, critical, the CLA, critical thinking, complex reasoning, writing performance. You could say, well, that's all well and good, but does it matter? Who cares? Well, here's the data. You have 3 times the likelihood of being unemployed if you're at the bottom of this CLA test distribution, the bottom 20%, compared to the top 20%. Right? There, 3 times you're 9% unemployment versus 3% unemployment. Right? If you master these skills and these competencies, you have a much easier way to kind of find a job. In our analysis coming forward, we also show that you're less likely to lose a job and you're more likely to find a good job. Now, large numbers of students, however, they have high debt loads. They don't have good jobs. They're unemployed, part-time employed, or with lousy jobs. And what do you do in that situation? Well, in the US, what we find is that 25% of the students are back living at home with their parents 2 years after graduating. These are students that went away to college and university, and 25% are back living at home. And they're back living at home because what else do you do with these debt loads and if you haven't made a successful labor market transition? We have some examples of students with graduates with good jobs living at home, saving money for all sorts of reasons, but a lot of this is the economic distress story. Again, like unemployment, except not as in a pronounced way, you're twice as likely to be living back at home with your parent if you're at the bottom 20% of the CLA compared to the top 20% of the CLA. These skills actually matter in helping you make these adjustments in life. So these things, we do have consequences for people's individual lives. And then this, I think, is the last empirical slide, and then I'll have just one summary slide to finish up with. As an educator, I care a lot about labor market outcomes. I care about where they're living and the adjustments they're making. But I also care about education because of its role in promoting democracy, creating citizens. And so one of the things we find very, very distressing in our data is the following. We asked students, or graduates, 2 years after college, how often do you read the newspaper in print or online? How often do you read the newspaper in print or online? 36% came back and said monthly or never. Monthly or never, right? The attitudes and dispositions we teach them in college about reading and writing and what it means to be a student and what it means to be a citizen, if they don't get it here in college, where do you think they're going to get it? You don't think they're just going to automatically develop these behaviors later in life? So 36%, not only did they not develop their critical thinking and complex reasoning skills to make sense of the rhetoric in the papers and the politicians, but they're not even engaged. They haven't even learned that to be a college graduate entails responsibility for the society. It's a privilege that comes with a responsibility. We ask the broader question, do you discuss politics and public affairs with your friends, family, or coworkers? 39% said monthly or never. You would think they would have a lot to discuss, since a quarter of them are living in their parents' basement. Tracks with the CLA, but much less strongly. It tracks more strongly with hours studying these things. Okay, let me close with the following point. The first one maybe is a US-centric point and less relevant for the Canadian context. But in the US, there's often, when things go wrong, there's a rush to fix it at the federal government level. In K-12 education, we've had no child left behind policies, which have introduced standardized testing countrywide in a way that I think has been very counterproductive and unhelpful. And so what we've said from the beginning of, since the work has come out, is that although there's a lot is wrong with higher education today, and it's in critical need of improvement, federal accountability, externally imposed accountability, is not the way to get at it. It's not the way to improve it. Instead, we argue that we need more accountability, but we need accountability at lower levels in the system where it rightly belongs. And so this is where we think there should be accountability. First of all, trustees or state regents, I don't know, this is a public system. You could think of what the equivalent terms are: the regents, the overseers, the trustees, the lords and ladies, whatever they're called here. They need to ask of their administrators questions not just about the bottom line of how much money have you raised, what research grants have you pulled in, how many scientists have you recruited, and so on. They need to ask questions also, and not ask questions just about the football team. They need to ask questions about how are they measuring learning? And in specifically, how are you measuring it? Where are areas that need improvement? And what are you doing to address it? 3 basic questions. How are you measuring it? Where areas need improvement? How are you fixing it? And for me, if an administrator who's running a school, I don't care if it's an elementary school, a secondary school, or a university, can't answer those questions, they have no business being in head of a school. That's a basic question that anyone running a school needs. How are you measuring it? Not imposing how you are. Where are areas that need improvement? How are you fixing it? Right? That's what schools have to be doing. 2, administrators. Administrators symbolically and substantively need to support undergraduate learning and academic rigor. They need to set up incentive structures that are not just about promoting research and scholarship for faculty and this and that, but promoting, incentivizing folks focusing on undergraduate education and academic rigor. Faculty as a whole, teaching is a curriculum ultimately is a faculty responsibility. Collectively, we need to get together and address these problems. Individually, if I want to address this problem, and make my class more rigorous and have higher grading standards, what happens? We know what happens. The students flee to the other classes, and they punish you on the course evaluations. You can't solve it alone. It's a collective action problem. You have to solve it, come together and solve it. And then finally, students at the end of the day need to be held accountable. We are doing them an incredible, incredible disservice to tell them that that their work is excellent when it's not. It's not fair to them. It's certainly, I don't think it's fair to them anywhere, any place where you're spending 4 years of your life and not getting accurate information about what you're doing. In the US, it's particularly not fair when you're saddling them with these debt loads that they can never walk away from. And you don't have the honesty and integrity to tell them what they're actually accomplishing. So I'd love to interact more with you about how you think this may or may not be relevant for Canada, and I'd also happy to address any questions you have about the study and the design. This is my email as well as the email of my co-author. We welcome communication, and our website where we have information on the project, including that report on outcomes 2 years out. You can download it for free on there. You can buy Academically Adrift on Kindle for $6, I think. You know, this is not, it's all available, and we hope you take advantage of it. So happy to take questions.
Just before we do that, I do have a mic here, so if you have a question, I'll come around and pass you the mic. And so please, we're also taping this for people who couldn't attend, audio taping it. And so if you could just wait until you have the mic to ask your question, then we'll make sure that gets onto the record. So who'd like to start off with a question? Great. Maybe you could just say who you are as well. And
hi there, my name is Shiv McFarlane, and I'm a student here at Mount Royal. I'm curious as to what you think the impact of teacher culture, particularly in the States, might have on any of these numbers. Education in the States is almost a prison sentence. If you actually go into it as a career, you get substantially less money than the needs of the field require you to educate yourself. The things you're responsible for and the things you're held accountable for are often exponentially greater than the pay grade or the payout, as it were. And in a lot of cases, from my personal interviews and experience and readings, I've discerned that a lot of teachers sort of hit that down curve as well and pass that on to their charges. So do you think that might have any impact on the ongoing?
Yeah, and so you're talking about secondary, like high school teachers, or the college professors?
Both, depending on the institution.
Yeah. Well, I think I would agree with some of that. So I would say, let's do two things with that, with your comment. First of all, let's talk about, there's a part of your question which is about the general culture. That part of what we're seeing here is not really about schools, but it's a general attitude in society about that treats teachers in a certain way and treats education in a certain way. And I think that's right. The general culture has moved to a place where the college degree is thought of as something, it's simply a credential that you're getting just a exchange for labor market success. It's not about something. The actual act of education is devalued. It's something that chumps do, nerds do, right? And so I think there is something. You're right. There are these larger cultural underpinnings to what we see here, which is a devaluation of the academic enterprise at school. Now, I was going to answer it in a different way, and I think is yes. I think I wouldn't let teachers off the hook as quickly as you might implied may have been implied in that comment. I think we're implicated in this. In U.S. institutions, colleges and universities, increasingly the game was promotion, tenure, raises, compensation. Everything is driven by research and scholarship, not just at the research universities, but at teaching colleges as well. There's good research to show how it's diffused all the way through the system. And so college faculty, which once put teaching at the heart and the core of what they were about, began to start pulling back and focusing on other activities that were perceived to be more valuable and important. And so in the U.S., you see faculty faculty are much less involved in student advisement than they once were. There's quasi-professionals that are hired to advise students. So I think faculty are, in a way, are more implicated in this problem. They're not just a victim of it. There's this larger general problem, but there's also, these institutions are institutions that we created. And anyway, next question.
Hi, thanks for your talk. My name is Joe Anderson, and I teach here, and I've also taught in the U.S. as well. And one of the things I see here in Alberta and in the U.S. is a real disconnect between the actual results and the perception of what we do in the community and in Alberta. There's pressure that it's about jobs, right? And people want us to be a job factory, a trade school. And yet what you're showing is that some of the things like philosophy, sociology, history, the arts disciplines, are the ones that maybe have a greater payout in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge disconnect between the rhetoric around what schools should do in terms of making jobs and the actual reality that maybe some of those things that don't directly lead to a job might actually directly lead to a job. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that kind of political cultural disconnect. Yep.
So I think you're right. The colleges and universities have often pitched themselves as being an answer to the economic development problems of local regions, and have seen that as a rhetoric that is useful in securing appropriations from governments. However, in some ways it's short-sighted because that rhetoric ignores that colleges and universities are about so much more. They're about kind of basic human development and citizenship, and they're not just about labor market. So we send the wrong signals to students and ourselves by embracing that rhetoric too fully. The second thing about kind of, if you do care about that the economic development piece and the labor market training piece, how do you go about and do it? How do you do it well? Well, these generic skills, you can't, they were lowest, if you notice that one slide here. They were lowest in the business schools. Business schools, however, if you look at labor market outcomes 2 years out, next to engineering, which is the best labor market outcomes, business programs are the next best. Why? Well, because business students in their last year of college and often beyond that are doing internships and apprenticeships. So they've got this smooth school-to-work transition, less likely to be unemployed, more likely to have a fairly good job early on. But it's not, they haven't learned the skills and dispositions that are going to do them well in the long term in the labor market. And so often, if we're just looking at kind of short economic returns, we do, I agree with you, it leads us to the wrong policy conclusions.
Who's next? Just wondering if there's anybody from business here that can
Hi, I'm also a student here at Mount Royal.
A what student?
A student here.
Oh, okay, good.
Communications, if it matters.
Okay.
But in light of what you just said, do you have any information or statistics on how co-ops and work terms might affect CLA scores? Because I know Mount Royal has a big focus on getting students into co-op programs and stuff like that.
Yeah, we weren't able to track that with our data, and so my sense is, again, it's the same thing with these business programs. Those are often very good programs to give people real-world experience that really do help in making labor market transitions. However, if they pull people away from traditional academic study, reading and writing and your typical academic pursuits, there might be a cost in the long term to some of these programs. Again, that's just, we don't have hard data on that. But that, I think if you draw out the implications from what we see in the business program, lowest hour studying, lowest, very low reading and writing requirements. But again, early short labor market, good outcomes. You know, that's what the data shows. But there's because they're focusing on these transitions, which are useful.
Well, apparently we don't have any business people here, but I'll speak on behalf of education, the second lowest. And I am sensitive to that and mindful of the importance of academic rigor in my own field. One thing I would say that's different from the US and Canada, and having attended American Educational Research Association, the American teacher educators are jealous of Canadians because we attract some of the best students. The first admission offers went out to admission into our education program, and it was admission GPAs of 4.0 and high school 93. So we attract stronger students to education. And in response to your point about, I'm not sure if your question was about cooperative learning experiences and so on, I would argue that when there's a really clear connection between the community service learning and the course content, that it can actually enrich. So for example, my students are currently working as tutors in schools and taking a course on reading development, and so they're having to directly use the course concepts to analyze what they're experiencing. So I think we need to think carefully about what kind of community service learning or cooperative co-op experiences the students are having, because if it is just a work experience that isn't directly tied to the academic content, then I think that your worry is right, that it does take them away from the academic study.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. I mean, in some ways, the better questions for educators is how do you do these things better or worse? Because all these things, there's lots of variation in, so including business programs. And the extent I would agree with you, the extent to which these co-op experiences help people see the relevance of their learning and make them more invested in their learning activities, they would be quite useful. And but again, I don't know. It's an empirical question to what extent, on average, they do that, or they pull people away from their learning.
I'm Colleen Bradley. I'm Director of Career Services, and I run co-op. One of the things that I'd like to comment with business, I think our history of prior to becoming a university with the applied degrees. If you take a look at business, it was very, very heavy in core courses, so I would agree that there may have been some, in terms of general education, in terms of making the most of your education, there was a lot of focus on the practical part of the education, and it did respond to a huge demand in the labor market, and in some respects, those programs worked very well. Was it ideal for this student? Probably not. But I think it was a stepping stone for us in terms of becoming a university. Since the inception of becoming a university, the experiential learning component now is in addition to the core curriculum, including the gen ed. And with us being very outcomes focused, the work that the students do on the practicums or the internships and the co-op experiences, critical thinking, their writing, those are all things that we measure in addition to what's going on in the classroom. So I see it as an enhancement, And quite often we bring back information on gaps that could be taking place, where there is a demand for skills in the labor market, and then that actually end up enhancing the classroom experience. And also the learning that takes place in a work experience program does enhance the classroom experience when the student comes back. So I have a little bit of a different perspective on the outcomes of that.
I appreciate you sharing that. I think one other thing I should say about looking at labor market outcomes and what's problematic about that. Labor market outcomes do vary across programs, across the programs, not often in ways, in complex ways. However, if you're looking at variation in outcomes across schools, very little difference in labor market outcomes, it turns out. The schools where people go are not strong predictors of their labor market outcomes. There's lots and lots of literature in labor economics in the U.S. that looks at, if you go to an elite college and university, does it help with labor market outcomes? And the answer is pretty definitive. Not for much, hardly at all, once you control for your prior ability. And so where colleges and universities do vary is on learning outcomes. And so I think often we make the mistake of trying to hold colleges and universities responsible for things that they can't really control, which is general labor market outcomes, economic development in the regions. These things, I'd like to give you guys credit for finding the shale oil, gas reserves and the prosperity of the region, but my guess is that these things were independent. And so tying school assessment of colleges and universities to labor market outcomes really empirically doesn't make any sense at all.
I'd had two questions in relation to your data charts that I was curious as to whether or not there was any more expanded information about them. Yeah. You had a pie chart as to how students spend their time, and on it a significant portion of that was in leisure. I'm curious because, as you know, there's a disparity between what a student can make and what a student's life costs that hasn't really kept par with inflation. Yeah. I'm wondering how much of an impact that working while being a student might have on that kind of a number. Yeah. And furthermore, my question in relationship to where they go when they're finished, whether or not they move back in with parents and how they remain employed, is the modern state of traveling for school and people who will cross state boundaries and go large distances in order to attend something that might benefit in the long run. But where do they go back to, and what options do they end up having in their local communities? How is it possible to make a new start in even a third place when you get out of school? Does that have an impact on how they're employed afterwards?
Yeah. So the study hours thing is easier for me to address. So the names up top there, this guy Philip Babcock at University of California, Santa Barbara, has a website where you can download his paper off his website. You can find it easily on Google. What he's done is he does track also the hours working over these decades, and students are indeed working 5 hours more today than they did in the 1960s. But the hours declined in studying are 13. And so it could be part of it, but it's not a sufficient explanation. Now, another explanation as well, in the U.S. in the 60s and 70s, there was this expansion. All sorts of different types of students went to college, university. It could be compositional. He breaks out the results for different parents' education, different racial, ethnic groups, different types of institutions. It doesn't matter, and different majors. It doesn't matter how you break it up, the same trends, down, down, down. So it's not just a compositional change. There's something more fundamental going on. It's not just employment. It's not just that. The other question you asked about kind of employment and mobility, I think it's a good question, but it goes beyond my, it's a more complicated one for me to respond to.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Vivian Forsman. I work in the Academic Development Center here. I'm curious, especially with your graph that shows the business school outcomes, the professional school accreditation people, like in the case of business, AACSB and EQUIS, and those kinds of organizations that also measure assessment of learning around critical thinking skills. Are those kinds of organizations making any impact on this broader picture, or are they just a sideline?
Oh, well, that's a big one. So, in the U.S., these business programs are 25% of colleges and universities. Students are now in these business programs. It's the biggest major. I don't know whether it's the same in Canada or not. And so, what about the accreditation piece? Are they able to sufficiently address these problems? So let me say something first nice about the accreditation piece, and then something not so nice. So the nice piece would be they've been in many ways at the forefront of pushing assessment of learning outcomes on college campuses and the importance of doing that. So their heart's in the right place. However, and again, I don't know how it works here in Canada, but in the U.S., the accreditors do not have the power to really make significant, in my opinion, make significant changes. This is the patterns we see. So accreditation is failing, right? We see dramatic declines. Accreditation has not been up to the task of doing this, and that's because they have very little power to actually, they go in with these site visits, they ask for the assessment outcomes. Well, you ask a bunch of higher education faculty to produce documents with assessment and learning outcomes. How high do you want them? We can do great. It's in the organizational literature, it's called symbolic compliance. Okay. So it's not, it's not working. I don't think it should be replaced by federal accountability. It's got to be replaced by us taking this job serious as educators, and not just saying we can't fix it. And yeah, I think hopefully that'll happen. I actually think some of the technological disruptions that are starting to wash up on the shores of higher education will potentially force a new discipline and rigor onto the institutions to focus on some of these learning outcomes, right? If students can do the whole thing online for next to nothing, we have to start demonstrating what we're doing and the outcomes here that justify people spending their time here and the government subsidizing it. Right? If we can't do that, why shouldn't the government just pay for the online alternatives? So I actually think these disruptive the disruptive currents out there will be very good. I think in some ways we became part of the problem is the product of our own success as an industry. That we developed a model that does a very good job of satisfying students as consumers and clients. In the U.S., if you ask students when they graduate, are you happy? 90% of them are happy with their colleges and universities. They love it. They thought it was great. Didn't learn very much, but if you ask them, they say they did. But they didn't work very hard, we know that. So, but they're very happy as consumers and clients. They have nice new dorm rooms. They have student centers, a new student center. They have new gyms. Right? In colleges and universities I visit, one after another, they're all jumping on over each other, competing to keep the students happy as consumers and clients. We're successful, but again, I think it'll be good for us to be a little bit less successful. Maybe that'll force us to go back, get back to our core beliefs.
Hi, my name's Candy McAlery, and I work in wellness services. We do a study each year called CUSC, and it's a Canadian University Survey Consortium. And students, the study that was done last year was for graduating students, and it's done nationally, and we can compare ourselves to comparable schools as well as nationally. And students were asked, on hindsight, they were graduating in their graduating year, what would have been important for you to have learned from your post-secondary institution? And the first thing was time management. And the second thing was confidence. And so around the time management, students stating they'd like to learn more or be better at being time managers and seeing your study. I wonder where you think that kind of skill development, being obviously important to success in academics, where should that learning be placed within the institution? How should that learning happen? And the other one around self-confidence was really interesting, and I wonder if that contributes to what you're seeing in your data, and that as we have students come into our classes, we're trying to work with them to move them forward and build their confidence as they go along being students. And I'm just curious around if that has some play in it.
Yeah, well, I'd love to see those survey results if they're publicly available, just for how they might be same or different than the U.S. So the time management piece. So I think one of the traditional ways that lessons where that was learned in colleges and universities, where you took a bunch of demanding courses that you couldn't possibly do all the work for, and you've had to figure it out. I don't know. I mean, and that's not, they're not forced to do that in the same way, and it's a disservice to them. I don't know. I mean, and you could actually, I'm sure, do workshops and this thing, and but in general, it's not. They're not getting exposed to the same treatment that kind of had that they did before. The confidence piece, I'm surprised that in the U.S. I think we have the opposite. That the students leave college, they are incredibly confident. They've of themselves and their life future. We asked. I didn't show the results. We asked them about. Questions like, do you think your life will be the same or better than your parents? 90% said, yeah, same or better than, their lives will be the same or better. They're very optimistic about the future, including the unemployed, the part-time employed, the living in the basement. But they don't lack, in our study, they don't lack confidence. But again, maybe that's a difference between a cultural difference. So I'd really like to see those results.
I see you've got Nessie up there, and my favorite question on Nessie is asking the students whether or not they think they've achieved more than they possibly thought they could achieve, which is essentially, have they been challenged enough? And I'm hearing from you that the challenge is a very important part. High expectations, rigorous grading, and that's going to mean grade sort of deflation from the A's, and a C means satisfactory, just not perfect, and so the student can get a reasonable assessment of what they're doing. So I get all those parts, but you said two things that weren't in your data, but I loved the phrasing. You talked about universities having pockets of excellence and pockets of despair. And my question is, do they overlap by necessity, or do they overlap at all? As in, if you have high expectations and the students are really doing well, they're being challenged, they're being pushed, to their intellectual and time management boundaries. Do we see despair kind of linked to that? Or have you thought of those connections at all?
Well, I mean, I guess all these things are empirical questions. I do think we owe it to the students to be a lot harder and tougher on them. I don't believe that we should be flunking them out. I mean, I think there's a lot of room between what's going on now and just pushing them out, failing students. Back your colleague next to you from the ed school, and I teach half-time in the ed school also, we are the worst. The studies in the U.S. In terms of grades it's more than 90% of the grades in ed schools are A's. I don't know whether it's the same in Canada. Because we think everyone is a great learner. You know, we believe in everyone. Everyone can succeed. So there's a lot of room between pushing people to despair and in giving them having reasonable standards. Now, one thing I've stumped on unsuccessfully at colleges and universities is the following quick fix for some of this stuff. And quick fix doesn't cost anything, right? Except political will. On a transcript, for every class you have 2 grades. The grade you got in the class and the average grade in the class. Like a software programming, you get one guy in an afternoon could do that, right? So you see very quickly at the end of the day, did the student excel by taking easy classes or excel taking difficult classes and did well in them? And you don't have to impose grading standards on faculty, which of course would revolt. I would revolt. I'm a faculty member. But you could just show the data. And then, guess what? Employers might actually look at the transcript because they can make sense of them. And in the US, they've stopped looking at the transcripts because they can't make heads or tails out of what it means. The course names are all crazy, of course, and then the grades don't mean anything because they don't take any work to get, B pluses.
Hi, my name's Jennifer Pettit. I'm chair of the Department of Humanities, and you've been talking a lot about assessment and learning outcomes, which I, in theory, agree with. However, at Mount Royal, we've had different versions of learning outcomes come and go, and there's been a lot of pushback, particularly from the Faculty of Arts, for instance, because to us they're often meaningless. We dutifully put them on our course outlines. We're not measuring them. We don't have the resources to measure them. So I'm curious your thoughts about sort of program level, course level learning outcomes, or if you don't have resources to actually make meaningful use of outcomes, what next?
Yeah, well, so again, I understand your frustration. I know often what we do is symbolic compliance here. That you want the learning objectives for the course. Here they are in the syllabus. And I also understand, people have reasonable objections to any assessments because no matter what the assessment is, it's imperfect, it's limited, it's flawed, it doesn't capture everything you want it to. However, I think it, particularly for humanities and social science professors, to get in, to see the assessment movement not as a threat to them, but actually as a way to demonstrate what they're doing and the value of what they're doing for the university and for students, because it's poorly understood. And so it can be done wrong, it can be done poorly, but I really think it's in faculty in those disciplines in particular have a vested interest in being able to document what the gains they're producing for students. And if you don't like the assessments that are out there, get together with colleagues and come up with your own. You don't need to use the CLA. You can do all this stuff. You could agree on a grading rubric. You could agree on a set of questions and just do it. I was talking to Randy at lunch about a college I visited that requires every student to turn in 5 essays before they graduate. And the essays are from different types, argumentative, expository, I can't remember my 5, but they're different types of writing. And the faculty come together and agree on how they're going to be graded holistically. And they are then tracked back to the classes they came from. And so you see, well, in these classes, they keep giving us, they think it's their best writing. So that's in itself is a signal of something. And they also have the scores that go back. It doesn't lead to a formal assessment where people are punished or things, but it's a way to kind of do something that has, internal, that shows to the students what you care about and shows to yourself your ability to kind of document it and make a case for what you're doing. And, wouldn't it be interesting if you had such an exercise here at Mount Royal, if all the students kept giving papers from your department?
Hello, my name's Carmela White, and I'm a student here. I'm just curious on your thoughts about, so for example, faculty, in order having high expectations and being a bit more regular and teaching to higher standards, how does this affect when it comes to student evaluations? Because we know that oftentimes students are, and I can speak on behalf of myself and many others, I'm sure, on an evaluation more so of how I thought the class went and perhaps how the professor was, and more of a student satisfaction thing rather than a learning outcome and how much has come from that. So how in that case could faculty balance this student satisfaction evaluation versus let's really teach and produce some learning outcomes?
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that the student evaluations have often incentivized people moving away from academic rigor, because it's a lot harder to have standards in academic rigor and do well on those evaluations. It's possible, but it's a lot harder than just being entertaining and lenient and all the rest. So it's incentivized the wrong behavior. It's also so we know in the U.S., and I don't know whether it's true in Canada, and I don't think it's true in this institution from what I've heard, but in the U.S., increasingly the teaching is not part of tenure decisions, promotion decisions, compensation decisions. It's research and scholarship. And when teaching counts at all, it's these course evaluations, which incentivize the wrong thing. But if you took teaching seriously, you could use multiple assessment indicators, right? So instead of just course evaluations, well, first of all, you could design the course evaluations a little bit better so that they ask questions like, how many hours did you study for this class? How hard was it? Were you challenged? Where you could have that information as well, but you'd also could do peer observations where faculty are observing each other's classes. You could look at samples of the work that the students are doing. You could, you could do a range of things to assess, if you really cared about teaching, to assess and value it. And I think in many places that's not really systematically done.
Great conversation so far. Are there any other questions? This is your chance.
My name is Qasim Saeed. I teach physics. I have a question. We start out in science, certain number of students, and some drop out, move to other disciplines.
Yeah.
Have they been tracked? Is there any study tracking those who drop out from science and go to other disciplines, and how well they do there, and do they do better than those who start out in those disciplines?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and my guess is there probably is a study, because there's a study on everything, right? I don't know this. I don't know the work though. I don't know the findings. I do think the hard sciences have a pattern of moving people out early on, and that's that is partly a product of what is going on elsewhere, right? Where one set of units has one set of standards and other places don't, and the students know it. So the students know that they can move from one to another. But I don't know the research in that area.
Richard, I'd like to ask you a question, just following up on what you were just saying. and certainly related to the data that you presented, how important it is to have students spend time studying and you know, be shown the proper kinds of standards. There, as you pointed out, there are within each institution very strong areas and other areas that need improvement. But that seems like a big challenge to try to tackle that. Because within each disciplines and areas, for example, that are certain norms that are just quite natural for those disciplines and different things that they value. So I guess just stepping up in business's absence right now, as an example, they would argue that their real goal is to help those students get employed, gainfully employed. And so they may have much more practical kinds of exercises and tasks rather than extensive reading and writing, just to play the devil's advocate a bit here. Well, which seems to help them get the jobs, but having that conversation with areas that have those very different learning outcomes, I guess, is a challenge, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the best response is not to set these things in competition with each other, but to see that you could do both. I mean, there are things that are happening in these business programs that are smoothing school-to-work transitions. I don't think that's everything that colleges and universities are about, but arguably that's important for students looking for jobs after they graduate. So we don't want to reject that. We could learn from it, but at the same time, it shouldn't be in competition with students actually having rigorous academic experiences where they're developing generic competencies that are going to do them well when they lose that job that they transitioned out of because the company found another Mount Royal apprenticeship intern that they could pay less than their wage. You know, so these things don't have to be in competition with each other. We should be able to learn from each other and to do our work better. And I apologize if I set up earlier a dichotomy between one and the other. It's really how do you do any of these things better by learning from the strengths of what the various programs offer.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? We still have a bit more time, but I think we've had a good chance to grill our speaker here. So, anything else? All right. If not, first of all, I would like to thank all of you for coming. This has been excellent. It's great to see the students here, the faculty, and everybody else from the institution pretty well represented. It's been really good representation from across the institution. But most of all, I'd like to thank you, Richard, for your very stimulating presentation. I think it's given us much to think about. And I would have to say this is one of the presentations that's generated the most questions that I've seen at Mount Royal, and the most interesting questions from my perspective. So please let's thank Dr. Richard Arum.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
And in case other people ask you about this who weren't able to come, we will have the tape available that people can listen to.